Next up, Tim Nicholson, who's a reader at the IoPPN, who's going to speak to us about sensorimotor features in autism.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody, and thanks for inviting me, Boyd, to talk about this topic. It's just to say this is not something I'm a particular expert in, a bit like Rich. It's really that this is something of interest, I think, to us. So I see this as a bit of a very brief summary, a bit like the sessions, the members' sessions that were run for a while about us giving a brief overview of something of interest to the group. But as with Rich and others, I became interested more in ASD from having noticed this potential association with FND as well. So, next slide. So yes, this is a very brief overview of quite a complex topic that hopefully many of you have had some experience through, most of you have been neurologists and psychiatrists about this, the sensorimotor features of autism, but they're sort of often very much under the radar and something that you were not necessarily focused on in clinical situations. And obviously this is from the lens and the viewpoint of neuropsychiatry, so there's obviously quite a big field within this, but hopefully it'll be of interest to get an overview. So first off, I'll just go through the formally recognised sensorimotor features of ASD, and also just give you a bit more of a background again about the diagnosis and how it fits in. I'll focus then a bit on the data there is for motor features, and hopefully there's some quite recent meta-analyses that I'll just give you a brief overview of. The one new thing that it'd be interesting to know whether this is something that's percolated up to your awareness about visual motor integration, and this seems to be quite an interesting connection between the motor and the social features of autism. So it's quite a sort of interesting topic, and it's some way quite analogous in some ways to the emotion-motor interactions we have in FND potentially as well. And then a bit of a speculations and future directions at the end. So the formally recognised sensorimotor ASD features. So just as far as ICD-11 goes, with all the caveats about the limitations of our diagnostic criteria, you really have the two key sort of features of autism that you need to show that the patient will fulfil. And obviously there's the social language, and then there's the restricted, repetitive, inflexible patterns of behaviour, interests or activities. And sort of nestled within, and the other two are obviously just qualifiers about occurring during development and causing impaired function. But if we dig into this restricted, repetitive, inflexible patterns of behaviours, interests or activities, this is where we find the motor and sensory stuff. And it's probably a bit too small to sort of mention there, but it's the motor stuff comes in within stereotyped movements, whole body movements, rocking, gait abnormalities, particularly walking on tiptoes, unusual hand or finger movements and posturing, particularly early on in the children with autism. And then there's the hyper or hyposensitivity to sensory stimuli, but it's also an unusual interest in as well. So there's a sort of connection about sort of reward or interest in this particular sensation as well. So it's not just about being sensitive or not. It's a slightly more complex thing. And the other thing at the bottom again, which I'm sure will be too small, is really that there's a sort of comment about the interaction with other disorders and the boundary of ASD with motor coordination disorders. And it basically says that it sort of points in the direction that this is of a lack of interest rather than necessarily a lack of capability or performance in coordination. But we'll go through the data such as there is about coordination shortly. So just to briefly go back to these motor symptoms in the diagnostic criteria. So there's the whole body movements, often rocking, but obviously there's quite a wide range of different whole body movements. Then the gaits, again, walking on tiptoes, which I'll briefly go through in a bit more detail, and then hand and finger movements and posturing as well. So the toe walking is something that I guess I've learned a lot about just by getting looking into this. I was much more thinking this was a sort of a milder form of just walking on tiptoes occasionally, but this is permanently walking high up on your toes to the point where the tendons change length and it requires surgical correction if that's what the child or the person with autism wants. But obviously this is something that is quite common and people sort of grow out of as such. But for those who it persists and then their heels can't actually touch the floor after a while, then surgery is considered if people can't tolerate or manage the conservative management to fix it. So it's quite sort of a striking, severe, but again, it's what should this matter? Unless it's painful or there's complications, and there's the social, conforming with the normal way of walking. So the sensory hyper and hyposensitivity I've mentioned, but just really say it's across all sensations, and it's very variable, very individual. And certainly I've seen patients with quite striking, quite personal differences, like a man I saw with Tourette's and ASD who couldn't bear wearing trousers and wore shorts, and when he was forced to wear trousers, it would lead to him being very distressed and uncomfortable as a child. So there's often these sorts of quite specific personal things that are actually got quite a big impact on people. So they're not something that trivial. They really affect people's sort of level of distress and discomfort, and then would obviously make people agitated and cause whole secondary consequences. So the motor data, such as it is, I'll very quickly whiz through this. The reference is there if you want to go through in more detail. But I was going to briefly make the analogy with the soft neurological signs of schizophrenia, because there's a sort of literature there, and as neuropsychiatrists we're aware of this, but it's sort of, it's getting more sort of meat into this quite sort of complex, interesting topic that's sort of we're always aware of. And then just mention gait, coordination, and catatonia briefly. So there was a nice systematic review by Paladzan and Robin Murray just about the neurological soft signs. And there's a whole range of different things, and it's what does this mean, and it's compatible with this neurodevelopmental sort of hypothesis of schizophrenia, or at least for a subgroup of those with psychosis. So, but just some interesting, recent review of the prognostic value of these abnormalities in predicting poor outcomes as well. So just to sort of flag this up as a sort of an analogous, potentially in some ways, sort of stream of evidence. So the meta-analysis of gait abnormalities, there's quite a lot that's been out there, and this was only just put together a couple of years ago, 21. So really showing a broad range of gait analysis in autism versus controls, and of course the data's a bit messy in terms of the types of patients who's recruited, what the inclusion criteria are. But what comes out in the wash here is that just highlighted the ones that don't cross the zero there. So with the forest plots, so it's the step width, walking speed, stance time, step time, stride length, stride time, and walking speed are what comes out from the meta-analysis as different between autism. But as always, it's what controls you're comparing to and the selection of the patients that matters. So coordination, this is the thing that was flagged up by ICD-11 as potentially being more interest than actual coordination problem. So thinking about sporting performance or ability to do complex motor tasks. So this is the data that there is. It's not the ideal forest plot to put in a presentation, but really it just comes out as an overall effect size of 1.2. So a small effect there, perhaps. But as with the other studies for gait, there's clearly issues with the data that goes in to creating that result. Catatonia is another very interesting thing. There's always been this association between ASD and catatonia, this is again quite a recent meta-analysis, and it's sort of not only 12 studies and only 7 which had data that could be put into the meta-analysis, but it showed pretty striking rates of catatonia. But of course, that this is just the forest plots there. But just putting up one of Jonathan Rogers' papers, just showing the overlap. Just thinking about this is just to show the Bush-Francis sort of criterion, and this paper which nicely sort of illustrates the grouping of these within a sort of good-sized group of patients. So just to think through how the overlap of a lot of ASD symptoms, what's catatonia and what's ASD, and you really need a change from baseline, and knowing what that baseline is to be able to make sense of the sort of softer end of catatonia, as it were. So lots more we could dig into on that, but I think the new interesting thing is this visual motor integration. So I'll quickly go through that. Stuart Mostovsky at Johns Hopkins has really been, this is a nice review of a lot of his past work, which I think is a really interesting connection, as is mentioned, between social and motor worlds, really. So there's actually, beyond the sort of data that's in the, or what's flagged up by ICD, we do have this, specifically ball catching and motor imitation seem to be particularly impaired in patients with ASD. The data, such as it is, if you take all patients with ASD, so around 90% show some significant motor impairment of some description, whether it's gait or something else. So they also mention this, those two things, the ball catching and the motor imitation, really require efficient visual motor integration. Sort of VMI is the sort of term that's used, and this seems to be particularly impaired and perhaps sort of relevant to why those two things seem to be, more common than the other motor symptoms in ASD. And this is sort of quite seemingly this is quite an important form of making your internal representation, and that sort of makes sense to us how that then connects to your interpretation of someone's face or what their behaviour in order to make your social inference about that person's mental state. So it gives us it sort of again connects the sort of motor world to how we you think it's sort of disconnected, and then suddenly actually it makes sense that this sort of motor, this sort of visual motor integration might be quite critical to social development and social skill development as well. So they make the postulation, which I think, the increasing evidence behind it, that perhaps this motor imitation is crucial for acquiring both social and motor skills. And this might be impaired, and you might be able to use this in some way to mitigate the disorder. So this is just quite a complex figure that I won't be able to go through in any detail, but it really just shows that the sort of neuroscience behind both those two things, both object interception for catching and motor imitation. I'd recommend sort of reading the reference just to get more details about that. It's very interesting about those two sort of similar but different sort of processes that might be affected by visual motor integration. And this is their proposal that perhaps you can find workarounds to with visual motor integration to perhaps improve both motor learning skills and potentially even social learning skills as well. So there's a sort of understanding this process might give us some tractable way of improving these skill developments within patients. So just some speculations of potential future directions. One very tenuous link is really to this thing called ASMR, and those of you who have children or spend a lot of time on YouTube otherwise might have heard of this thing. But I've only briefly heard of it, but it's sort of quite and it's been postulated in a very we're sort of going quite lowbrow in our science here, but the proposal that this might be useful for sensory symptoms and hypersensitivity in ASD. And there are some reports, particularly amongst, but there's no data yet to show that patients with ASD might be more common in experiencing this. So it's when people get tingling sensations, which are pleasurable but also relaxing and help people go to sleep, when they hear people talking or certain noises that are often sort of got a social component to them as well, interestingly. So where do you learn about ASMR? You go to ASMR University, and I recommend enrolling there just to have a look around, if nothing else. So it's all about these tingles, getting these sensory, but it seems to be there's just a subgroup of the population that get this or can do it. But it's also expectancy driven, as you'd expect. So it's not just once you're primed to get it, you often get it again. So once it's been triggered, and then people sort of seek this out, and the whole communities that they have lots of share on social media videos that stimulate, and everyone's got slightly different triggers, whether it's sort of rustling or a noise or a speaking sound. So just very quickly, one of the reasons I particularly went in this direction was because of Ben Michael here, who many of you might know, became an inadvertent ASMR superstar, having done some neurological examination videos, which were ticking along with 100 views or so a month, and then suddenly went completely viral. And he now has, you can see here, one guy watched it 500 times. But he does have a very nice, soothing voice, and this is what seems to be triggering for some people with ASMR. And what I particularly liked here was the fact that his mentor and supervisor, Professor Solomon, actually isn't very good at this at all. So he's been completely taken over by his young star, and he only got 300,000 views, whereas he's getting millions. And those 300,000 are probably just because they watched him and they try this other guy, and he's not very good. So, yeah. And just a quick elbow in the ribs of Tom Pollack. He's got hardly any followers on it yet, as well, with his Queen Square videos of neurological examination as well. So, and he's not here to defend himself, so fantastic. So just very briefly, coming back to science, there's a great paper from Cognitive Neuropsychiatry just about ASMR, and paper of the year really in terms of the most interesting things it connects with. It brings in ASMR with metacognition and tulpomancy, which is where people get sort of hallucinations or unusual experiences, but in the context of meditation and sort of cultural practices of Buddhism. So a fascinating paper if you want to go and visit that one. So finally, summing up, sensorimotor symptoms are common and relatively overlooked in ASD. There's a wide variety of complex sensorimotor features that seem to make this interesting connection, perhaps analogous to emotion and behaviour connections we might have in FND. Visual motor integration bridges those motor and sensory issues. Could this be the same as we see non-motor features of Parkinson's? Could this be the sort of non-cognitive side of ASD that's actually quite important mechanistically, and this sort of hidden burden perhaps of symptoms? And also our understanding of this might help us develop new strategies to treat ASD or FND as well if we understand this. Very briefly, a plug for the Clinical Neuropsychiatry MSc, for people, just encourage you to let people know about it. The International Neuropsychiatry Association, free membership on offer for a time-limited period. I'm not sure when that's ending, Tony, but anyhow, just for that. The Global Neuropsychiatry Network, if you haven't joined. And the final plug is for neuropsych.net, which is a great group of junior trainees who do journal clubs and other fantastic stuff. So visit the neuropsych.net website for videos of our journal clubs and other exciting stuff. So I've gone a bit over, so thank you.